Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Bridget Nelson. On this episode, Elaine Kub gives her analysis of corn, soybean, and wheat markets. Jim Specht explains a forensic strategy for dicamba injury in soybeans. Daren Redfearn shares information on the upcoming Nebraska Grazing Conference. And Dr. Aaron Hager explains his research on the management of herbicide-resistant pigweeds. Elaine Kub is our market analyst this week. According to this week's Crop Progress report, fast development in both crops continue as corn is now 63% silking and soybeans are now 65% blooming and 26% podding. According to the USDA, soybean prices dropped to a 9-year low due to good crop conditions and a hazier export outlook. Corn has also been projected lower by the agency based on observed prices to date and the current status of soybeans. For hard red winter wheat, the production has increased 10.3 million bushels from last month's forecast. We talked with Elaine Tuesday morning to discuss the markets, but began by asking for her analysis of the recent Crop Progress report.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very fast progress in the silking, which means pollination is going to happen fast, which potentially means that the grain could dry down faster and we could have a faster harvest. That would have implications for sort of the August-September basis markets, but it's probably too early to say that for sure. In those condition ratings, that we can say for sure, that it's happening faster. We've seen growing degree units accumulate much faster this summer. After a very cold spring, we have 200 to 400 more growing degree units already accumulated in the Corn Belt. So absolutely, it's happening fast, and it's kind of at exactly the wrong time for the crop that's in Missouri and Kansas, where they still have some of that D3 extreme drought. That's where we're seeing the condition ratings drop down. For most of the Corn Belt, the heart of the Corn Belt, most of this crop is still beautiful and still likely to have very high yields, but there's just those pockets in Missouri, southern Iowa, where those crop ratings are starting to diminish.
What do you expect for the prices?
Well, we have really dropped quite a lot in corn, and a lot of that will be due to just seasonally when you have a beautiful crop growing, prices do tend to fall, but mostly corn has been drugged down by soybeans. That price ratio, the soybeans have fallen much more relative to corn, and the soybean to corn price ratio in the new crop markets is only like 2.3 to 1 when it's usually 2.5 to 1. So corn is falling alongside soybeans and alongside soybean meal, but it's established a low at about 350 on that December chart, and maybe that's as low as it's going to get. We are seeing, commercial traders, the commercial processors and the feeders that are going to need this grain long term, they are starting to step into the futures markets and act as buyers.
Well, and also the USDA just reported in the WASDE report that there's going to be higher stocks, acreage, and exports, and so that means quite a bit.
Yeah, and it's a good thing they made those adjustments here early in the summer, because one thing they didn't adjust, Bridget, was the overall yield projection. They left that there at 174 bushels per acre. So that's a huge threat the next time we see a WASDE report next month and the month after that. There's this threat looming over the market that yield number will go up, and the stocks to use ratio and the ending stocks numbers will all probably only become more bearish as the summer wears on.
So soybeans, they're sort of still the hot topic right now. And right now with imports, with the 25% tariff with China and the U.S., right now it's not as a big impact because according to the USDA, exports are usually not even that high during this time of year.
Right, this is not the time of year when we would be seeing lots of movement out of the ports, but price-wise, it has been very interesting to see that the futures prices have fallen almost exactly 25% off of their, beginning of March highs. The cash price discount between U.S. soybeans and Brazilian soybeans is about $1.90, which again is exactly 25% of the cash price of U.S. soybeans. And I don't necessarily think it's a coincidence that we are seeing those prices fall 25%, and then this is the moment when, like I mentioned, the commercial traders are getting in there and saying, this is our opportunity to lock in some prices. You can go out as far as summer 2020, and on the futures board, you can lock in futures for soybean futures at less than $9. So this is kind of a golden opportunity for long-term buying opportunities, which is not to say that it can't fall farther. So it fell that 25% based maybe just on the tariffs, But like I mentioned, that's not to say that it couldn't fall farther based on, the production prospects, just the bearish weather or the bearish conditions, if we see them continue through the summer.
Right, because the USDA also reported that that soybeans hit a 9-year low on their prices.
Yeah, so they hit that low. They had sort of a reversal day. They tried that, earlier this month on July 6th. We thought we were seeing sort of a reversal, and it just fell back down, and we were just stuck in this long-term bearish trend. So like I mentioned, I am not necessarily willing to say that the trend is over yet, that it has been reversed, but it is heartening to see that activity getting in there. We're seeing total open interest in the soybean market is rising, which means it's not just short covering. There is actually folks coming in there and buying these futures.
In addition, with these tariffs, right now, instead of the U.S., China is getting more of their soybeans from Brazil. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's the danger, that we are going to turn away or discourage our best customer. Our number one customer has always been China in the past decade. We're going to discourage the best customer to come directly to us and maybe have to go through different channels, less efficient channels that will take more transportation costs or more transaction costs. And in the meantime, they're building up the business that could be coming out of Brazil, or the grain business coming out of Ukraine. China could start looking at these other competitors of ours. So it's not helpful to producers here in the United States when there is inefficiency in those markets, or when there are extra costs in the markets. So the USDA only reduced our total soybean export projection by 250 million bushels in that last WASDE report. But whether that's, the number that ends up being final or not, it kind of doesn't matter, because even the soybeans that do get sold will have to be sold at a lower price to the producers here in the United States. Will have to accept a lower price so that end users can pay the same price. It's just a lot of inefficiency for everybody.
On the other hand, though, wheat has been doing pretty good, especially in Nebraska.
Yeah, yield-wise, farmers are really having a nice time in Nebraska. That hard red winter wheat market is doing well. All of the anecdotes coming out of there as well, the protein levels coming out of Kansas and probably Nebraska were also favorable. So you can say good things about wheat production. And in fact, we also had a nice pop in wheat prices a couple of weeks ago. That was more due to the European wheat harvest, where they're having struggles with wet weather during harvest and perhaps quality losses into a big market that was an export competitor of ours. So we're not seeing that Paris milling wheat chart able to make it past resistance yet. If it were able to do that, then I would expect to see U.S. wheat prices respond in the same way and really start rallying alongside that European wheat market. At this point, it's just sort of bouncing along here, but good opportunities for farmers, perhaps to sell the extra bushels that they have after this good harvest.
Next week, Daryl Peel will join us to look at cattle markets. The common herbicide dicamba has been used for over 50 years to control dicot weeds. Today, the dicamba-resistant soybean cultivars, known as Roundup Ready to Extend soybean, allow higher dicamba doses to be used for weed control in fields that are planted with those types of soybean cultivars. Even though this improves weed control, it also increases the risk of low-dose drift of dicamba onto fields that contain non-dicamba-resistant soybean cultivars. Although soybeans are very sensitive to dicamba, this synthetic auxin only affects soybean leaflets that are still undergoing cell division. Because of this, Nebraska Emeritus Professor Specht says that producers are able to use a forensic strategy to help determine when soybean plants were affected by this herbicide. To learn more about this strategy, we met with Jim Monday morning and began by asking him for more information about synthetic auxins.
Synthetic auxins are manufactured versions of the auxins that are naturally found in plants. And dicamba and 2,4-D are the two major ones that are used in a lot of cropland. They can now be used on soybean because of the new either dicamba-resistant or 2,4-D resistant soybeans that have been offered by the commercial seed industry. Both of those chemicals act on dicot weeds and also dicots like soybeans that don't have tolerance. We'll talk about dicamba today mostly because the 2,4-D versions are not readily available yet. So dicamba will injure plants pretty severely if used at a regular dose, but at low doses you have off-target drift that can injure non-dicamba resistant soybeans.
Soybeans are very sensitive to dicamba. However, this synthetic auxin only affects dicot leaflet regions that are still undergoing cell division. Therefore, any fully developed leaflets will not be impacted by dicamba.
Okay, soybeans grow in, once they get past what we call the V1 stage, when the first trifolia is just starting to unroll, you get a new nodal leaflet trifoliate every 3.7 days in soybeans, no matter where you are in Nebraska and what maturity group you're growing. So what you can know is that's kind of a historical track of time, development time, that you can use to your advantage in making forensic analysis of any disease or thing you found with a specific leaf.
Throughout a leaflet's development, cell division occurs in different locations of the leaflet margin. In almost developed leaflets, the cell division will have finished along the majority of the leaflet margins except at the leaflet tip. And for very young leaflets, cell division occurs along the entire circumference of the leaflet margin. This system of development allows producers to use a forensic strategy that will tell them when dicamba exposure likely occurred. To properly estimate the occurrence, Jim uses the Fair and Cavaness 1977 staging system.
Okay, this is a famous publication in 1977 in which the authors developed a way to score soybeans. They start with the 0 node being the cotyledonary node, and the next one is the 2 unifoliate nodes that come out. That's node 1, and then every node thereafter is a trifoliate. And again, from that node 1 on up, it's every 3.7 days.
To further understand how to forensically estimate dicamba exposure on soybean plants, we asked Jim to demonstrate how to properly assess the plant.
By the way, this infield leaf counting method was developed by Jenny Reese, the excellent extension educator out in York and Seward County, so I'd like to give credit for this to Jenny. Okay, so they can go out to the field and they can look at the plant. They may spot dicamba leaf tip injury, which is classic dicamba, in which the leaf tips are shortened in like a drawstring. You know, when you drawstring a bag, or it'll pinch there. And so you find that. So you look up and down the plant and you can see the first one that shows that is probably this one right here, which is located here. So that was when the dicamba spray incident occurred. So if you count from the bottom, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this one's 6, that means it was sprayed when it was near V6. And so you count on up to get to today. This is V8 up there. So subtract 6 from 8, and you have 2. So 2 times 3.7 days for each of these nodes is about a week ago, right? And so you know then that the dicamba spray on this plant, given that you're looking at it here today, was about 7 to 8 days ago in development time. Now, if you want to know about calendar date time, you have to go to a crop model or whatever, like SoySim, which is embedded in soy water. Producers can use that to track when that occurred based on their planting date and their variety maturity group, and they can figure the calendar date.
By using a crop model like SoySim, soybean producers will be able to receive a translation of a VN stage in crop development time to a calendar date of that VN stage occurrence.
Well, SoySim is a little bit difficult for most lay people to use, but Soy Water is a Nebraska Soybean Board funded project that will project crop development stage if you give it the planting date and the maturity group. So you can go there, put those 2 things into your Soy Water input. It's online, available for free, and then it'll tell you what date this node was present at, calendar date-wise.
You can learn more about dicamba and this forensic strategy by reading Jim Specht's CropWatch article at cropwatch.unl.edu. It is time to register for the 18th Annual Nebraska Grazing Conference. This year's conference will be held August 6th through the 8th at the Kearney Ramada. According to Nebraska Extension forage crop residue specialist Daren Redfearn, this year's conference will not only include multiple keynote speakers, but also a field tour. Daren met with us earlier this week to share more information about the conference and how one can register online.
Okay, so the Nebraska Grazing Conference will be held this year from August 6th through the 8th. That's a day longer than it normally is. One of the things that we've done this year, trying something out, is to add a tour on Monday afternoon prior to the more traditional meeting that's going on Tuesday and Wednesday. The tour will leave the Kearney Ramada Inn around 12:30. We'll make a stop at Jim Choquette's. Jim has been a livestock producer for years and years and years, does quite a bit of intensive grazing, incorporates cover crops into his cropping system. So we'll listen a little bit about his production or his system there at his place. Christine Sue, who's with Pasture Works, she's the chairman of the board for that group. She's actually been an exhibitor at this program in years past. We've got her on the program this year to talk a little bit about some of the monitoring that they have going on, and she's going to talk about quite a bit of technology as well as we move through that. Jim O'Rourke is going to talk a little bit about some of the applications of monitoring. After we leave Jim's, we'll stop at the Rose Sanctuary where they use a lot of prescribed fire to manage wildlife in grasslands there. So between the two stops, we'll cover those that have an interest in the livestock production, the grazing management specifically, and then the second stop will those people that have some interest in some of the wildlife management will also address some of those needs. That day we'll finish up with dinner out at the Buffalo County Extension Center. Tuesday and Wednesday are more traditional days, if you will. This year we've got Ron Hansen, faculty member from years past here at the University of Nebraska. He's going to talk a little bit about some of the farm and ranch transition or generational transfer that they kind of the buzzword. Last year we did a workshop with one of the speakers, and this year Ron is also going to lead a workshop on Tuesday evening. We've got topics on multi-species grazing, grassland monitoring, planting alternative forages. I do have a couple of outside speakers talking a little bit about managing grasslands for wildlife. So this covers a lot of interest from a lot of different groups. Primarily producers is what we're interested in, is giving these guys a feel for some of the things that are going on around this region in the Great Plains. A lot of our agency people will have an interest in the monitoring, as well as some of the management of wildlife. And also the more traditional faculty like myself can always find some information there that they can use to apply. So for more information about the Grazing Conference, there's a link on grassland.unl.edu under Nebraska Grazing Conference, and there's a link to the registration, and then there's also a link to the agenda that's there as well.
As Daren mentioned, you can register online for the Nebraska Grazing Conference at grassland.unl.edu. Be sure to register today, since a $20 service fee will be added after July 31st. Due to narrow profit margins in recent years, analyzing investments in areas like equipment is necessary when budgeting. For some growers, owning a sprayer and applying their own fertilizer and chemicals provides a more favorable return than paying custom rates. However, sprayer ownership isn't for everyone. You can learn more about the different perspectives on sprayer ownership from two Northeast Nebraska growers by reading the July Nebraska Farmer. Both Palmer amaranth and water hemp are invasive pigweed species that can be very difficult for producers to manage in their fields. University of Illinois Extension weed science specialist Dr. Aaron Hager believes that although Palmer amaranth and water hemp share similar characteristics, Palmer is what he and his research team fear more than anything. We met with Dr. Hager at the recent Palmer amaranth management field day held in Carlton, Nebraska, to learn more about this pigweed species and how to manage it.
We really hadn't had a lot of experience with it before. We know Palmer has been in Illinois for years, but it simply has not really manifested itself as a driver weed species yet. And so when we found this field, we thought it would be a great opportunity to learn more about it instead of trying to base our recommendations to Illinois farmers on other states' work. We had about a 3 or 4 year duration of projects that we stayed on this field trying to look at not only what are some herbicide options that farmers could use, but also trying to measure the biology of the species. You know, how many emergence events do we typically see a year? How big does this thing get? You know, are there other environmental factors that maybe tend to either favor its growth and establishment or maybe impede it a little bit? And so it's been a really interesting weed to work with. A lot of similarities between Palmer amaranth and our driver pigweed species, which is still water hemp. But certainly, hands down, Palmer is the one that we fear more than anything, because it's a species that I think has been shown time and time again. It can literally devastate a farm in a very short period of time if people don't give it the attention and in some strange aspects, the respect that that species deserves. It's not something that you really want to ignore. I've said before, and I'll say again, one of the things that really helps palmer become established in a field or in an area is nothing more than apathy. People who say, that one or two scattered weeds across the field, well, they won't hurt anything, but this is a different species. It plays by its own set of rules, the way it grows and reproduces and affects crops, and it's not going to adapt to us, we're going to have to adapt to it.
To better understand Palmer amaranth's resistance, Dr. Hager says he looks at many aspects when considering the control of the weed.
Well, we looked at a lot of the same things that a lot of other programs look at. What are some of the effective residual herbicides? What are some of the effective post-emergence herbicides? A lot of that depends on the resistance spectrum that you may have in a population. We also looked at, the idea, can we layer things, 2 or 3 applications of residual herbicides to essentially try to keep it from ever coming out of the ground, because ultimately the way that we win the battle against dioecious pigweeds is not just opening up a new jug and treating the field with it. Really, the best strategy is trying to attack these populations and these species at the most vulnerable stage in their life cycle. And that's not a 1 or 2 inch tall palmer. The vulnerability lies in the seed, and that is that the seeds do not remain viable in the seed bank indefinitely. So whatever we can do in a very integrated program to keep palmer from producing seed for about a 2 or 3 year period is going to pay dividends for farmers for years into the future.
While Illinois does have its own strong population of Palmer amaranth, Dr. Hager says it's more significant, invasive, and widespread here in Nebraska.
Well, what we've seen here in Nebraska, I think you have areas where palmer is a more significant problem across a higher frequency of acres than what we have in Illinois. We can find it in about a third of our 102 counties, so it's not like it's not there, because it is. But so far, we really have not had a lot of instances where it's invaded fields and farmers haven't paid enough attention to it to the point now where maybe that field becomes unfarmable, for a year or two.
Staying aware and paying attention to palmer populations is key to keeping it under control.
Really, again, it needs to be a zero tolerance species for us. The best way that we can stay in front of palmer is to stay in front of it and not let it pass us by, because a couple years that we ignore this and the seed bank begins to build up, we've got problems for years in front of us. So keep the awareness up there. Don't overlook this. If you've got a strange looking pigweed in your field, you're not sure what it is, pull it up, get rid of it, send a sample to us. We'll be happy to identify if it is palmer. And then we need to really make sure that we pay attention to these populations, in these particular fields for years in the future.
Next week, Nebraska Extension Weed Management Specialist Amit Jalla will join us to discuss how to identify the different characteristics between Palmer amaranth and water hemp. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast, and of course we dealt with the heat last weekend, and we finally seen it break apart as we got in the middle of the week as we had a cold front move through. Most of the major precipitation activity occurred between Tuesday night and Friday morning across the state. The vast majority of course, was Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, where we've seen some heavy thunderstorm activity in western and northern Nebraska. Some of that did slide into southeastern and south central Nebraska during the early morning and post-sunrise hours of Wednesday morning, and then we've seen a repeat performance for another wave moving down through the Dakotas and into northern Nebraska as we were in Wednesday night into Thursday, which did lead to some significant hail in isolated locations and a couple isolated tornadoes, but that storm petered out as it moved toward the southeast and precipitation totals were much less than desired. Now the good news is that over this next 7-day period, there's 3 opportunities for precipitation. Unfortunately, 2 of them are more for western Nebraska, with 1 of them for eastern Nebraska. So let's get to the upper air models, and as we go to the upper air models, what we will notice is we do have high pressure ridge from the southern plains all the way into the central plains, have a trough over the eastern United States, and a trough trying to move into the Pacific Northwest. At the surface, there's a low over in southwestern South Dakota, high pressure firmly in control across the central and southern plains. And in terms of precipitation, most of the moisture that impacted us late in the week has now now moved to the east of us and moving up the eastern seaboard. As we go into tomorrow, high pressure still remains in place, backing up a little bit, trough in the east. We do have surface low down to our south over Oklahoma, is projected to at least lift moisture up into the northern plains, and seeing some moisture across western Nebraska and western Kansas in the monsoonal flow. Now as we go into Monday, that ridge pretty much stays in place. A trough weakens somewhat. We do see some high pressure coming in, very weak as it is with the cold front that'll move through Sunday night into Monday. Just showing some precipitation. Once again, it doesn't look as widespread as what is being depicted here. Most of it will occur in western Nebraska. And then as we get on the day on Tuesday, the trough starts to re-strengthen across the Great Lakes. High pressure comes in behind that cold front, cools things down slightly, brings much drier air into our region. There is still showing some leftover precipitation in western Nebraska, but I think the majority of this is probably overplayed. And then as we get into Wednesday, that trough starts to deepen. That's going to start pushing some of that cool Canadian air back toward the southwest, invading much of eastern Nebraska as surface high pressure starts to be in control. We do still show some precipitation, but once again, this is monsoonal flow, and it does not look to be anything associated with an active upper air pattern. And then as we get into Thursday, that trough bottoms out. That's going to bring a little bit more cooler air into the eastern half of the state under the influence of Canadian high pressure that's going to be situated over Iowa and Illinois. And we do see some precipitation breaking out, and that is basically the ridge is going to start to pull eastward, so there's going to be a warm front associated with this ridge as it progresses to the east. And some of that moisture with this ridge moving toward the east will allow that moisture to spread into eastern Nebraska. Surface high pressure system starts to move its way toward the Great Lakes. We do see precipitation indicated for Nebraska, although this again may be overdone. In terms of 8 to 14-day forecast, with that trough over the Great Lakes still pointing toward cooler than normal conditions in terms of precipitation. With that northwest flow moving into the region, we do have the opportunity for several more waves of precipitation in our region.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn, wheat, and soybean markets, a forensic strategy for dicamba injury in soybeans, the upcoming Nebraska Grazing Conference, and Palmer Amaranth. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Oklahoma State Extension Livestock Marketing Specialist Daryl Peel will join us to look at cattle markets. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Bridget Nelson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.